In the basement of a Georgia plantation in 1864, 23 children were discovered locked away. All of them bore the same distinctive features: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, and auburn hair streaked with gold. Huddled together in darkness, these children were found by Union soldiers who forced open the iron doors of the Thornhill estate in Burke County. Some were as young as 4, while others were approaching adolescence. What the eldest, a girl of 13, told the officers was something that made veteran soldiers physically ill. Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood. Only once in a letter marked confidential, buried in regimental archives for over a century, is the incident mentioned in military records from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry. The Thornhill estate is omitted entirely from local histories of Burke County, as if the plantation and its mistress never existed at all. But they did exist. And what Catherine Thornhill created in those 16 years between her husband's death and the arrival of federal troops represents one of the most disturbing chapters in American history, a systematic breeding program designed to create generations of enslaved people who could never escape their bondage, genetically tied to their owner. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Thornhill and the nightmare she built in rural Georgia, I need you to do something for me. If this story is making your skin crawl, hit that subscribe button right now. On this channel, we dive deep into the darkest corners of American history. These are the stories they don't teach in schools, the secrets buried in courthouse basements and forgotten military records. And I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and tell me what state or city you're in. Are you close to Burke County, Georgia? Does your own town have secrets like this buried in its past? Let's find out together. Now, let's go back to where it all began. To a cold February morning in 1847, when a young widow inherited a dying plantation and conceived a plan that would haunt Georgia for generations. The winter Catherine Danforth Thornhill buried her husband was the coldest Burke County had seen in 20 years. On 1,700 acres of red clay soil, 7 miles southwest of Westboro, the county seat, sat the Thornhill estate. By 1847, Burke County was cotton country, though not as prosperous as the Black Belt regions further west. The soil here was tired, overworked by decades of single-crop farming. By the 1840s, plantations that had flourished in the 1820s were struggling, squeezed between falling cotton prices and rising costs. Laborers had been thrown away by the Mexican War, and bitter divisions over territorial expansion split communities. Among the more successful properties in the region had once been Thornhill Estate. From his father in 1838, Jonathan Thornhill had inherited it with 42 enslaved workers, adequate equipment, and manageable debt. But a poor manager and an enthusiastic gambler was Jonathan. When a winter fever claimed him in February 1847, the estate was mortgaged to the hilt, the fields were producing barely enough to feed the workers, and creditors were circling like buzzards. A widow at 28, Catherine became. She was 19 when she had married Jonathan, a strategic match arranged by her father, Theodore Danforth, a prominent Augusta merchant. Old Georgia money were the Danforths, descended from settlers who had arrived in the 1730s. By private tutors, Catherine had been educated, spoke French passably well, and had been raised with expectations of managing a substantial household. A failing plantation with crushing debts and a 16-year-old son who looked at her with something approaching hatred was not what she had expected to inherit. From his first marriage, Richard Thornhill was Jonathan's son. Giving birth to him in 1831, his mother had died, and Jonathan had remarried 5 years later. An interloper who had replaced his real mother was how Richard had always viewed Catherine, never warming to her. A sullen, bookish boy, he spent most of his time in the estate's small library, avoiding both his stepmother and the practical work of running a plantation. Weak, impractical, and entirely too sentimental about the enslaved workers was how Catherine found him. So dangerous was his once suggested idea that they should be taught to read, Catherine had forbidden him from speaking of it again. Its declining fortunes were reflected in the plantation itself. A 2-story structure of whitewashed brick with 6 columns across the front portico, built in 1805 in the federal style, was the main house. From the window frames, paint peeled, and in 3 places, the roof leaked. A mix of inherited pieces from Jonathan's family and cheaper replacements purchased when the good pieces had been sold to pay gambling debts was the furniture inside. In similar states of disrepair, behind the main house stood the kitchen building, the smokehouse, the dairy, and the overseer's cottage. Further back, beyond a line of live oaks draped with Spanish moss, were the quarters where the enslaved population lived. On the property in 1847, 31 people remained, 11 men, 13 women, and 7 children. Over the previous 3 years, 16 others had been sold off to satisfy Jonathan's creditors. Those who remained knew that more sales were coming. Over the quarters like fog over the Savannah River, fear hung. In a kind of controlled fury, Catherine spent the first month after Jonathan's death. She met with the estate's lawyer, Ambrose Talbot, who laid out her options in blunt terms. Sell the property and the remaining workers to settle the debts and perhaps have enough left over to live modestly in Augusta under her father's roof, or find some way to make the plantation profitable again, which Talbot considered unlikely given the state of the cotton market and the estate's depleted resources. To Catherine, neither option was acceptable. Returning to Augusta would mean admitting failure, living as a dependent spinster in her father's house, forever marked as the widow who couldn't hold on to her inheritance. But she also recognized that traditional plantation management wouldn't save Thornhill Estate. The land was worn out. The equipment was old. Insufficient in number to work the cotton fields profitably were the remaining enslaved workers, and she had no money to purchase more. Poring over the estate's account books by candlelight during one of these sleepless nights was when Catherine conceived her plan. With the cold logic of desperation, the idea came to her. If she couldn't afford to purchase workers, she would breed them. But not in the haphazard way most plantations did it, offering minor incentives for couples to have children and waiting 15 years for those children to become productive laborers. No, something far more systematic, more controlled was what Catherine envisioned. A population of workers who were biologically tied to the estate, who could never be sold because they were her own descendants, who would have an instinctive loyalty to the plantation because it was literally in their blood. This was what she would create. Monstrous was the plan. But to Catherine, it was also elegant. She was still young enough to bear children. From among the enslaved population, she would select the strongest, healthiest men and conceive children with them. Knowing their parentage, these children would be raised, given slightly better treatment than the others to ensure their loyalty, and when they reached maturity, would be paired with enslaved women to produce the next generation. A workforce of 50 or more, all bound to Thornhill Estate by ties that went deeper than legal ownership, within 20 years, Catherine calculated she could have. She began keeping a journal to work out the details. Of personal feelings, this was no diary. For that, Catherine was far too practical. Instead, what she called her cultivation records was what she created, filled with calculations, observations, and plans. In a simple substitution cipher, she wrote, replacing key words with innocuous agricultural terms. Seedlings became children. Rootstock became the men she selected. Plantings were pregnancies. For livestock, the journal's pages were covered with diagrams that looked like breeding charts because that was essentially what they were. A man named Isaac, 24 years old, born on the plantation and known for his physical strength and steady temperament, was Catherine's first selection. To the main house on a March evening in 1847, she summoned him after the other workers had retired to the quarters. As, first planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild, what happened that night was recorded in Catherine's journal only. She summoned him again 3 weeks later and then twice more before the month ended. By April, confident she was pregnant, Catherine was. With the same emotional detachment she might note the planting of cotton, she recorded this in her journal. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. In late May of 1847, Richard Thornhill first suspected something was wrong with his stepmother. He noticed she had stopped taking her morning rides around the property, claiming the heat bothered her, even though the Georgia summer had barely begun. More frequently, she took her meals in her room, and had dismissed the house servant who usually attended her, preferring to manage her own affairs. For a woman as concerned with appearances as Catherine, this withdrawal was unusual. But a conversation Richard overheard in early June was what truly alarmed him. Hidden behind one of the tall bookcases, he had been in the library when Catherine met with Miriam Grayson in the adjacent parlor. The local midwife was Mrs. Grayson, a sharp-featured woman of 50 who attended births for both white and enslaved families throughout Burke County. Slightly, Richard knew her. As a skilled practitioner, she had a reputation, but also as someone who asked few questions and kept confidences. Absolutely. You're certain of your condition, Mrs. Grayson asked in a clipped professional tone. Quite certain, Catherine replied. I should think sometime in early December. And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said. A pause occurred. Against the bookcase, Richard pressed himself, hardly breathing. My late husband and I were intimate in January, Catherine said evenly. Shortly before his final illness. Of course, Mrs. Grayson's voice carried a note of something, not quite disbelief, but a careful neutrality. I'll need to examine you properly, and we should discuss the arrangements for the delivery. Will you want me here at the house? I will, and I'll need your discretion, Miriam. Absolutely. You have it, as always. Until both women had left the room, Richard waited before emerging from his hiding place. His hands were shaking. The mathematics didn't work. For the entire month of January, his father had been bedridden, barely conscious most days, racked with fever and chills. Many nights, Richard had sat with him. No possibility of intimate relations between his father and Catherine had there been, which meant the child Catherine was carrying had been conceived after Jonathan's death in March or April with someone else. The implications made Richard sick to his stomach. If word got out that Catherine had conceived the child out of wedlock, the scandal would destroy what little remained of the family's reputation. Immediately, creditors would move to seize the property. In Augusta, the Danforth family would disown her. But beyond the practical consequences, Richard was appalled by the deception itself. As his father's legitimate heir, Catherine intended to claim this child, to lie to everyone, to build her future on a foundation of fraud. He considered his options. Directly, he could confront Catherine, but he was only 16, and she held all legal authority over the estate. In Westboro, he could go to lawyer Talbot. But without proof, it would be his word against Catherine's, and as a minor, his testimony would carry little weight. In Augusta, he could write to his grandfather Danforth. But from the estate, Catherine read all outgoing mail. Instead, Richard began to watch Catherine carefully, looking for evidence, trying to understand what she was planning. Regularly, he noticed that she summoned Isaac to the main house, always after dark, always when the overseer was away in town occupied with duties elsewhere on the property. Different from her treatment of other enslaved workers was how he saw Catherine's manner toward Isaac, not kind exactly, but less overtly hostile. In full sentences rather than curt commands, she spoke to him. By July, certain Isaac was the father of Catherine's child, Richard was. With horror, the realization filled him, not just at the violation of social and legal boundaries, but at what it revealed about Catherine's character. With an enslaved man, she had coldly, deliberately chosen to conceive a child, to claim that child as her late husband's, and to maintain this lie indefinitely. What kind of woman was capable of such calculated deception? In early August, during one of Catherine's rare trips to Westboro, he found part of the answer. Related to the estate, Richard had been searching for legal documents. Of finding something that might give him leverage over Catherine, he had vague thoughts when he discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a locked drawer of Catherine's writing desk. For a determined 16-year-old to pick, the lock was simple enough. In cipher, the journal was written, but Richard had always been good with puzzles. Working in secret whenever Catherine was out of the house, it took him 3 days to crack the basic substitution pattern. What he read made his blood run cold. With Isaac, Catherine wasn't just having an affair. A deliberate breeding program, she was implementing. In chilling detail, the journal laid it out. Her plan to conceive multiple children with selected enslaved men, to raise those children as part of the plantation workforce, and eventually to breed those children with each other and with other enslaved people to create an ever-expanding population of workers who would be genetically tied to Thornhill Estate and to Catherine herself. There were charts, calculations of expected births over 5-year periods, notes on which men displayed desirable physical characteristics, speculation about whether traits like strength, intelligence, and temperament were heritable. From a livestock breeder's manual, it read like something, except the livestock were human beings. Several pages of the journal, Richard copied, translating the cipher into plain English, his hand shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. This was evidence. Of Catherine's depravity, this was proof. To the authorities, he could take this. He could expose her. But that night at dinner, with those cold green eyes, Catherine looked at him and said casually, "Richard, have you been in my study recently? Some of my papers seem to have been disturbed." "No, ma'am," Richard lied, his throat tight. "For good reason, I keep certain documents locked away," Catherine continued, cutting her meat with precise strokes. "If I ever found that someone had violated my privacy, broken my trust in such a fundamental way, I'm afraid I would have to take serious action. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Because family loyalty is everything, Richard. Everything. Without it, we're simply animals staring at each other." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know you loved your father very much. I would hate for his memory to be tarnished by scandal, especially scandal that might emerge from within his own household. the threat was clear. If Richard tried to expose Catherine, she would find a way to turn it back on him, to paint him as a disturbed, resentful stepson inventing lies about a grieving widow. Who would people believe? A respected plantation mistress from a prominent family, or an awkward teenage boy with known resentment toward his stepmother? That night, Richard returned to his room and burned the pages he had copied, but he kept watching Catherine, and he began to feel increasingly unwell. With fatigue, it started. By September, Richard found himself exhausted by mid-afternoon, unable to focus on his books. His appetite diminished. That made it difficult to think clearly. He developed frequent headaches. By October, he was experiencing muscle weakness and occasional stomach pains. Great concern, Catherine showed. She insisted Richard stay in bed. Herself, she prepared his meals, bringing him bowls of soup and plates of soft foods. To examine him, she summoned Mrs. Grayson. In the absence of a proper physician, the midwife, who also served as a general medical practitioner, diagnosed nervous exhaustion complicated by possible consumption. Rest, fresh air when Richard felt strong enough, and a special tonic that Catherine obtained from a pharmacy in Augusta was what she prescribed. Tuberculosis often strikes young men of sensitive disposition, Catherine told Richard, adjusting his pillows with attentive care. Your father had a cousin who died of it at just your age. We must be very vigilant. Better, Richard knew. During his hours in the library, he had read about arsenic poisoning. In himself, he recognized the symptoms, the fatigue, the digestive troubles, the muscle weakness. Slowly killing him, Catherine was disguising murder as disease, eliminating the one person who knew her secret and posed a threat to her plans. But he was too weak to fight back, too isolated to get help. Absolutely, the house servants followed Catherine's orders. Rarely, the overseer came to the main house. On the second floor, Richard's room was, and by November, he barely had the strength to get out of bed, let alone escape the property and reach Westboro. One final attempt to expose Catherine in late November, Richard made, writing a letter to his grandfather, Danforth, in Augusta. To compose it, it took him 3 days, working for a few minutes at a time before exhaustion overwhelmed him. Her breeding program, her journal, the poisoning, he described. He sealed the letter and gave it to one of the younger house servants, a girl named Pearl, begging her to post it in Westboro without telling Catherine. The letter, Pearl took, but she also told Catherine, terrified of what would happen if the mistress discovered she'd been keeping secrets. Expressionless, Catherine read the letter, then burned it in the fireplace in front of Richard. You're very ill, darling, she said softly, almost tenderly. The fever is affecting your mind. You're imagining things that aren't real. It's a mercy really that you won't have to suffer much longer. On December 3, 1847, Richard Thornhill died, 3 weeks before his 17th birthday. From Westboro, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, summoned to record the death, noted consumption as the cause, and remarked that the young man had wasted away with tragic speed. Decorously, Catherine wept at the funeral. For a full year, she wore black. After Richard's burial, 4 days, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son. After her late husband, she named him Jonathan and claimed he had been born slightly premature, which explained any questions about timing. From the birth to Catherine's widowhood, few people in Burke County thought to count backwards. To themselves, those who did kept their speculations. Openly, not the kind of thing one discussed, was it? The years between 1848 and 1856 transformed Thornhill Estate in ways that seemed almost miraculous to outside observers. Slowly, the plantation that had teetered on the edge of bankruptcy regained its footing. Cotton production increased. The enslaved workforce grew. As a shrewd, if somewhat reclusive, plantation mistress who managed her property with uncommon efficiency, Catherine Thornhill earned a reputation. But at a terrible cost that no outsider ever saw, that efficiency came. For more times between 1848 and 1853, Catherine gave birth. Daughters named Elenina, Abigail, and Margaret, and another son she called Samuel. Only by Miriam Grayson, who by now was deeply complicit in Catherine's schemes, was each birth attended. For her services and her silence, the midwife received generous payment, regular fees that far exceeded her normal rates, plus a small cottage on the edge of the Thornhill property where she could live without paying rent. Far beyond delivering Catherine's children, Mrs. Grayson's role extended. A darker function, she also performed, ensuring that enslaved women on the property only gave birth to children who fit Catherine's careful plans. Outside Catherine's controlled pairings, when pregnancies occurred, and they did, because human beings will form attachments and intimate relationships, even in the most oppressive circumstances. Plant-based compounds that induced miscarriages were provided by Mrs. Grayson. In a small room behind the overseer's cottage, away from the main house, away from witnesses, she performed these procedures. Rarely, the women subjected to these forced abortions spoke of them, even to each other. Profound was the trauma, unvoiceable in a system that already denied them autonomy over their own bodies, the grief. Through the quarters anyway, whispers circulated. Of women who had been pregnant 1 week and bleeding the next, who were told they had simply lost the babies naturally, though everyone knew Mrs. Grayson had been involved, were the stories. One woman named Ruth tried to resist. In the spring of 1851, she was 5 months pregnant when Catherine discovered that the father was not the man Catherine had designated for her, but instead a young field hand named Samuel, with whom Ruth had formed a genuine attachment. Immediately, Catherine ordered Mrs. Grayson to terminate the pregnancy. Ruth ran into the pine forest southwest of the plantation. She made it nearly 4 miles before the overseer's dogs tracked her down. Back to Thornhill Estate, she was dragged, held down by 2 men while Mrs. Grayson forcibly administered the abortifacient compounds. Physically, Ruth survived the ordeal, but something fundamental broke inside her. Mechanically after that, she worked, spoke rarely, and died 2 years later during a fever outbreak that swept through the quarters. She was 24 years old. But just one among many was Ruth's tragedy. By 1856, 7 children of her own had been produced by Catherine's program, all of whom were being raised in a peculiar liminal space. Legally enslaved, they were. In the county records, Catherine had registered them as such, claiming them as children born to enslaved women on the property, which gave her legal ownership of them, but in practice they lived in the main house, wore decent clothes, ate better food than the other enslaved children, and received informal education from Catherine herself. In 1856, young Jonathan, the eldest, was 8 years old. A serious, quiet child, he resembled Catherine strongly, the same green eyes, the same auburn hair, the same sharp features. Of his father, Isaac, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1849, he had no memory. A complication once his purpose had been served, Catherine had found Isaac's presence. From his sale, the money helped pay down some of the estate's remaining debts. Nothing of their true parentage, the younger children knew. As fortunate orphans whom she had taken into her household out of Christian charity, Catherine told them. To read and write, she taught them, a dangerous illegality in Georgia, where teaching enslaved people literacy was prohibited by law. But confident no one from the outside would ever enter her home and discover what she was teaching these children, Catherine was. For the next phase of her plan, she was grooming them, preparing them. But patience, that phase required. Before they could be used for breeding, the children needed to reach physical maturity. Her meticulous record-keeping, Catherine continued, tracking their growth, their health, their temperaments. Which children showed physical strength, which seemed more intelligent, which were more compliant, she noted. Decades in advance, she was planning pairings. In the meantime, she continued having children of her own. Between 1854 and 1856, 3 more were born. Sons named William and Henry and a daughter called Caroline. From among the enslaved men on the property, each had a different father carefully selected. Ruthlessly practical were Catherine's criteria. Physical health, strength, decent teeth, good eyesight, no obvious impairments. For their personalities or characters, she cared nothing. Simply genetic material to be utilized, in her mind, they were. In the matter, the men themselves had no choice. To the main house, when Catherine summoned them, they came, knowing that refusal would mean brutal punishment or sale. What was happening, some of them understood, that the children Catherine bore would be their own biological offspring, even as those children would be raised to think of Catherine as their benefactor and savior. Extreme was the psychological torture of the situation. To become fathers to children they could never acknowledge, never parent, never protect, they were forced. One man named Thomas was summoned to the main house in 1855. 26 years old, he was married to a woman named Hannah, who lived in the quarters. With their first child, Hannah was pregnant. When Thomas learned that Catherine intended to use him for breeding, he tried to refuse. In front of the assembled enslaved population, the overseer, a brutal man named Virgil Kane, had Thomas whipped. For life, 39 lashes that left his back scarred. To the main house anyway, then Catherine had him brought. Thomas complied. He had no other choice. But to Hannah about what happened in the main house, he never spoke, and Hannah never asked. Too poisonous to voice, some knowledge was. By 1856, a population that looked normal on the surface, but was actually structured along Catherine's twisted logic, was housed at Thornhill Estate. The field workers, about 20 adults and their children, who worked the cotton and corn under the overseer's supervision, were there. The house servants, 3 women and 1 elderly man, who cooked, cleaned, and maintained the domestic space, were there. And then there were Catherine's special children, 10 in total by 1856, ranging in age from 8 years old down to infancy. In the plantation hierarchy, a strange position was occupied by these children. For their privileges, the other enslaved people resented them, but also pitied them for what they represented. On some level, what Catherine was doing, everyone in the quarters understood. For eugenics or breeding programs, they didn't have language. Those terms would come later, but the pattern, they recognized. How Catherine kept detailed records of the children, how she measured them periodically, how she noted their development in her locked journal, they saw, and they waited with a kind of horrified anticipation for what would happen when these children grew up. What Catherine intended, everyone knew because, in subtle ways, in comments and instructions, she had made it clear. To produce the next generation of workers, these children were being raised. In Catherine's long-term plan to create a workforce that could never leave, could never be sold because they were genetically bound to her and to Thornhill Estate, they were tools. Disguised as innovation, it was an abomination. But in the isolated world of a rural Georgia plantation in the 1850s, with no outside oversight and absolute power concentrated in the hands of the property owner, Catherine was able to pursue her vision without interference. In Usporo, the only person who posed any potential threat was lawyer Talbot, who handled the estate's legal affairs and thus had access to records that might raise questions. But a practical man who valued profitable clients was Talbot. And by 1856, profitable was Thornhill Estate becoming. The cotton yields were improving. Through Catherine's breeding program at no acquisition cost, the workforce was growing. Debts were being paid down. Because he benefited from Catherine's success, Talbot asked no uncomfortable questions. The isolation of the plantation helped maintain secrecy. From Westboro, Thornhill Estate was 7 miles, connected by a rough road that was often impassable in winter. Few were neighbors. 3 miles away was the nearest plantation. Rarely, Catherine entertained visitors and discouraged social calls. When she did interact with other plantation families, usually at church on Sundays or at occasional gatherings in Westboro, as a proper widow, managing her late husband's property with Christian virtue and practical wisdom, she presented herself. Behind the whitewashed brick walls of the main house and in the quarters beyond the oak trees, no one suspected the systematic horror occurring. And even if they had suspected, would they have cared? In the 1850s, this was Georgia, a society built on the brutal exploitation of enslaved labor. More systematic, more coldly calculated than most was Catherine's program, but not fundamentally different in kind from what happened on thousands of other plantations across the South, it was. Of the entire situation, that was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Monstrous was Catherine's breeding program, but it was also logical within the framework of a society that already treated human beings as property to be bought, sold, and bred at will. The underlying logic of slavery, she had simply taken, and followed it to one of its most horrifying conclusions. But on such profound injustice, systems built contained the seeds of their own destruction. To Georgia and the entire South, change was coming, though in 1856, how soon or how violently it would arrive, few people could imagine. To Burke County and all of Georgia, the late 1850s brought increasing tensions. National politics was dominated by the question of slavery's expansion into new territories. In anxious tones at the courthouse in Westboro, the violence in Kansas Territory where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were literally killing each other was discussed. The presidential election of 1856, which put James Buchanan in office, did little to resolve the fundamental conflicts tearing the country apart. To politics, Catherine paid little attention. On Thornhill Estate and her long-term program, her focus remained fixed. By 1859, her eldest children were approaching adolescence. Jonathan was 11, Elalina was 10, Abigail was 9. For the breeding phase of Catherine's plan, they were still too young, but she was already making preparations, already selecting which of the enslaved young women would be appropriate partners when the time came. During this period, in a previously unused section of the mansion's east wing, Catherine constructed what she called the Heritage Room. For family records and memorabilia, she told the house servants it would be a storage space. A shrine to her breeding program, in reality, it was. Lit by oil lamps with walls lined with shelves and a large table in the center, the room was windowless.